François Picard debate, and it's almost Thanksgiving in the United States, but millions of Americans will be hard pushed to find much to be grateful for this year. 9% of the population is out of work. One study by the New America Foundation claims that a fifth of American families saw their household income shrink by a quarter last year. Political leadership has been needed like never before. But in Washington, it's deadlock as usual this week. The so-called super committee of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans has proven it's anything but. It missed a deadline on an agreement to reduce a record national debt. That means across-the-board spending cuts will take effect as of next year. Well, President Barack Obama is now urging Congress to approve his measures and has warned the public what will happen if they don't.
Next week, they're going to get to take a simple vote. If they vote no again, the typical family's taxes will go up $1,000 next year. If they vote yes, the typical working family will get a $1,500 tax cut. All right, so I just wanted to be clear for everybody. No, your taxes go up. Yes, you get a tax cut.
That's President Obama, who's hoping to be re-elected next year. Well, the Republicans, remember, are still battling it out to find a contender for next year's vote. And here's one of them, Newt Gingrich, on how he feels about the so-called super committee.
When you narrow down from 535 to 12, you don't have enough people willing to slow down and learn. So all they can do is argue with each other. They're not looking for new innovative breakouts. They're arguing the same argument they've been arguing for 20 years.
So who is to blame for this standoff? Democrats or Republicans or the entire political system of the United States? Well, joining me to discuss that tonight, Ellen Wasselina is a member of Republicans Abroad here in France. Zachary Miller is a member of Democrats Abroad. Amin Ouazat is Assistant Professor of Economics and Political Science at the INSEAD Institute. And joining us on the phone from Washington tonight, Daniel Hamilton, Executive Director of the Centre for Transatlantic Relations. Now, thanks very much to you all for being with us. Before we begin our discussions, let's take a quick look at this. This shows who Americans blame for the political deadlock in Washington. This is a Reuters Ipsos poll. It shows that 18% blame the Republicans and 13% blame Barack Obama. 7% blame the Democratic Party as a whole. 19% say it's a whole lot of them all together. They're all at fault. So, Ellen Wasselina, as you can see there, most people say it's the Republicans' fault. What would you say to that?
I would say that obviously we have to have this discussion about the debt, which is very important, and say that they have to come to some sort of solution. They were not able to come to a solution again. But then can we give the question differently and say, how was Barack Obama leading on this issue? So important too. And how can we get out of this, or will we go down the way that Greece has gone down?
Now, Zachary Miller, this has turned out rather well for Barack Obama, hasn't it? Because if the super committee didn't reach a compromise, he now gets to have his whole package pushed through. And he's saying, look, the Republicans are the one who are not letting this go through. And if it doesn't go through, your taxes are going to go up.
Well, I think that people are seeing clearly, and that the fact is that the Republicans have stonewalled, have just said no, no, no. They actually signed 270 members of Congress, Republicans, have signed a no tax raise, no tax hike pledge. And that's part of the problem. We even have Republicans who are saying, former members of the Reagan Party, Reagan administration, David Stockman and domestic advisor Bruce Bartlett, have both said the Republicans are on the wrong side of this, and that Ronald Reagan himself raised taxes 11 times, and that this is the wrong way for the Republican Party to proceed.
Ellen Wasselina, are the Republicans making it too hard to negotiate? They just won't budge when it comes to tax hikes?
I think there are other ways of raising revenue. And raising revenue, you have to look where you can cut obviously into the budget. You cannot always raise taxes. You can see the investments that the president wants to put through and saying that, yes, we have to build infrastructure. Yes, it has to come from the government. But what about giving the small business owners a break, giving them the tax breaks, letting them invest in the economy, and not it always being driven from the top down, from the government?
What would you say to that,
Well,
Zachary?
no one's talking about raising any taxes on the smaller businesses. People are talking about fair taxes to corporations. That's what, the whole conversation right now is about, that fact that corporations are not paying their fair share, that the wealthiest people, the 1% in America, are not paying their fair share when their profits have increased geometrically, but they're not paying their fair share of taxes, and that's the real problem. And the Republicans are, determined to keep that in place. Because those are the people that are lobbying them, those are the corporations that are lobbying them, that are paying for their reelection.
I mean, Wazad, as we can see, this is a little insight as to what's going on in Washington. The Republicans don't want to budge on tax, and the Democrats don't want to budge on cutting spending and benefits. While this is all going on, Americans are suffering, aren't they? And next year, they'll be suffering even more.
Yeah, I mean, what's pretty clear is that in the U.S., politics are becoming really polarized. And I think one reason for that is that there are lots of safe seats in Congress, lots of safe seats at the House of Representatives. And that's due to the design of congressional districts, details. But what that means is that for many candidates, it's more important to convince the more extreme voters in the primaries than to convince the average voter in a congressional district. And that has led basically to this very polarized political system, which is basically locked. Now, if I want to look at what Barack Obama said in the short video excerpt that you showed, it's more complicated than that, because what he also faces is the debt ceiling, and they will have to lift the debt ceiling. So I think
national debt is currently $15 trillion.
That's
it's
probably
a record.
Right. Yeah,
and they do, because remember back in October, wasn't it? They had to raise the debt ceiling so
That's
they could,
right.
And that was the last time we had this wrangling and this deadlock.
And that was only temporary, and they will have to have a new vote to lift the debt ceiling. So it's pretty much a balanced game here. No one has the upper hand in this game. The last thing I want to say about taxes is that there were lots of tax hikes during the Clinton administration, which actually led to an increase in revenue. So the usual argument that Republicans are putting forward, that actually if you increase taxes, this will discourage effort and work, is not actually supported by evidence. And so it's really unclear whether this kind of disincentive effect of taxation is actually playing a role here.
All right, well, let's bring in Daniel Hamilton on that from the Centre for Transatlantic Relations. Are tax hikes what's needed to help fix the US economy, or might that be a threat to growth?
I think it's part of it. I think you've just heard exactly why we have the problem we do. It's a serious issue. We are paying a very high economic price at the moment as a country because of our inability to solve this political stalemate. I would argue Europe's having almost a similar debate. The euro crisis is fundamentally a political crisis and a political stalemate. Both sides of the Atlantic are facing this type of politically induced economic crisis. I believe the economic fundamentals are strong in the United States, but we are paying a very high price for this blockade. And, it's a very straight, I don't think it's rocket science. It's a very straightforward proposition. The United States is borrowing 40 cents on every dollar we spend. Medicare, Social Security, interest on the debt is going to absorb all the revenues we collect as a country. The country has to pay, is aging, has to pay new health costs. We have to take care of a deficit of about $12 trillion over the next decade. That's the gap we're going to have to cover. So this is quite serious. It has to involve a package. It has to involve a range of taxes. It has to range some cuts and reordering of our entitlement programs. And neither side is willing to address sort of what the package could look like. The Republicans don't want, they just are adamant. No new taxes. The Democrats are adamant. No entitlement cuts. No looking at anything like that. And the American public wants all of the services that's provided, but they don't want to pay for it and are in deep denial.
Right.
And so the problem is not that we don't know what to do. It's that we don't want to do it. And I think this is the problem we're facing in the United States, that this political blockade will have to, people say it will have to be resolved by the next election. But that's a year from now. And after any election in the United States, it takes another 6 months to actually get anything done. So you're looking at the prospect of another year and a half of just complete stalemate, and then the prospect that these cuts, these automatic cuts that might come about, will start to do the work that the politicians can't.
Well, let's add another voice to that now. Here's the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, and he's pointing out that it is indeed the political system, the deadlock in Washington, that's jeopardizing the future of the US economy and not, in fact, the fundamentals of economic growth. Take a listen.
The biggest single threat to our economy is not Europe's instability or China's monetary policy or anything else. It is this partisan paralysis and political cowardness that I think is defining Washington, and we just cannot afford to have that continue. This is a disaster for this country and an embarrassment.
That's Michael Bloomberg speaking earlier, who's also an independent, so neither on the Republican or the Democrat side. But there's some hope, isn't there? I mean, when we talk about the fundamentals of the economy, if it is just about political reform, that is more achievable, isn't it, than perhaps the situation we're looking at here in Europe with the very, very low growth and even recession on the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key, a way to get out of the problem would be to have strong, sustainable growth. Because when you have growth, you have a larger taxable base, you can collect taxation revenues, and you can repay your debt. And the problem right now is that our tax revenues are lower than what we should have to actually repay our debt without rolling the debt over, without asking actually creditors to pay for our debt service. So if we had growth, that would be really great. Sustainable long-term growth. Now, the problem we're facing is that in Europe is that we have weak demographics. Demographics are key for growth. The U.S. has slightly better demographics because of all these immigrant inflows in the last 20 years, and so Europe has a more serious problem in that way. But there are similarities, and one similarity is that both areas, both the Eurozone and the U.S., need to have innovation. They need to be producing better products because
private sector.
They need to have better products because we now have a world where there's basically free trade.
Is raising taxes on businesses and corporations the way to do that? I mean, that seems to be counterproductive, doesn't it, to that?
Right. So for one of the most effective ways to actually, for instance, increase employment in Europe has been to basically cut part of the payroll taxes on workers. That has been one of the most effective way to raise job creation. But
to give incentives to employers to hire.
To give incentives to employers. So different kinds of taxes lead to different outcomes. I don't think we can have like a very simple message here. In France and in other Eurozone countries, also small firms are facing a problem of liquidity. They don't have liquidity. You see in the U.S., even entrepreneurs using their credit card to fund their expenses. So there's a problem of liquidity. So if we could provide some fresh air to entrepreneurs, that would actually be good for the economy. Liquidity problems. So we could have like a short-term stimulus for small firms that would actually foster job creation. But the sheer size of the effect is really subject of debate, and I don't think there's an economist that can tell you by cutting taxes you will generate that percentage points of growth. I don't think that's clear.
But certainly not raising them in this recession would be beneficial.
Well, quite to the contrary, raising taxes in a recession would be beneficial, and it has in the past been beneficial. Let me read exactly what has been said here. Reagan signed a 1982 tax increase into law September 1982. Following that tax increase, as former Reagan economic domestic policy advisor Bruce Bartlett pointed out, the gross domestic grew 4.5% in 1983 to 7.2% in 1984. An exceptionally strong performance. Now, these are the people who were in the Reagan administration, Stockman and Bartlett, talking about how a tax increase does help the economy and how it would help the economy now. These are people who've been through it, And so what the Republican Party is saying now is totally in opposition to what Reagan did during his term.
Right. Are the Republicans committed to opposing any tax rises at any cost?
If you look at what the candidate's been saying, and I'm not a candidate, but if you look at what the candidate's been saying, we're talking about getting the economy going, getting growth going, getting people to hire again, and having the economy moving again. Of course, there are, as you know, health care costs to be considered. Where do we cut? Can we cut across the board like military expenses, and should it not be discretionary? Again, there's a security. There's different. You can't just say, okay, we're just going to cut across the board either. I think there should be some measures given too. Should we? Yes, of course, the war costs a lot of money in Iraq and Afghanistan. We can talk about national security, indeed. So.
Well, let's listen to one of the candidates, because I think we've got Mitt Romney, who is the front runner still, I believe, in the Republican campaign. Let's have a listen. Let's have a listen to what his campaign ad is saying about the debt problem in the United States. So any rise in tax must be linked to a reduction in government spending. Let's go back to Daniel Hamilton. Do you have any hope that these 2 points, it seems ideological almost, doesn't it? It's benefit cuts versus tax hikes. Can the two ever reconcile these 2 points that they don't seem willing to compromise on?
Well, that's the conundrum we face. Both become so ideologically rigid or playing to their own constituencies that they seem unable to think about the country's interests. And I think that is what's causing such an anger and outrage among much of the public. Although, as I said, I think the public is denying sort of what it would take to resolve this. I think we face, 2 tracks probably that are not very appealing. One is you could say it's the wolf at the door, that there's going to be a sudden rattling in the financial markets. We've seen indicators of that. Which leads to, interest rate spikes. It leads to a big decline in the dollar. It leads to another recession. And the markets start to take action for us because our politicians can't. That's a dramatic scenario, but it's not one that one should dismiss. The other is maybe more insidious. You could say it's more like termites in the woodwork, that this just keeps dragging on. It's a less visible crisis. But it means, slower economic growth. I agree with the points about economic growth. It means, fewer reserves in the government to invest in the future. The president does make that case, that in order to maintain its American competitiveness, you have to win the future. You have to build the kind of infrastructure and the kind of framework and innovation support policies that will enable the United States to do that.
Okay.
But we're having this ideological debate basically about the role of government in the market.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And seem unable to resolve that in the political constellation we have at the moment.
All right, hold that thought for us, Daniel Hamilton. We are going to have to take a short break. When we come back, the international headlines and the second part of tonight's France 24 debate. Don't go away.